Late version of Annales Cambri. A late version of the Annales Cambri doubled the B text, written at the end of the 13th century and influenced by Gorphy, records for the year 573 that after the battle of Arfarid between the sons of Elfer and Gwendula, son of Cedio, in which the battle of Gwendula fell, Merlin went mad. The earliest version of Annales Cambri entry in the A text, written 1100, as well as later copies, the C text, written towards the end of the 13th century, do not mention Merrid. Merrid furthermore shares similarities with the shamanic bard figure of Taliesin, alongside whom he appears in the Welsh triads, and in Vita Merlini, as well as in the poem Ymadidin Myrddin, a Taliesin, the conversation between Myrddin and Taliesin, from the Black Book of Com Arthian, which dates back to Rachel Brownwich as certainly before 1100, that is predating Vita Merlini by at least half a century, while telling a different version of the same source. According to Villa Mark, the origin of the legend of Merlin lies within the Roman story of Marsus, a son of Circe, which eventually influenced the Breton and Welsh tales of the supernaturally born bard or enchanter named Marzin or Mardin. Later developments. Sometime around the turn of the following 13th century, Robert de Baron retold and expanded on this material in Merlin, an old French epic poem presenting itself as the story of Merlin's life, as told by Merlin himself, to be written down by the real author, the actual author claiming to have penned merely a French translation, only a few lines of what is believed to be the original text have survived, but a more popular prose version had a great influence on the emerging genre of Arthurian-themed chivalric romance. In Robert's account, as Gorphy's Historia, Merlin is created as a demon spawn, but here explicitly to become the Antichrist intended to reverse the effect of the harrowing hell. The infernal plot is thwarted when a priest named Blaise, the story's narrator as well as perhaps Merlin's divine twin in a hypothetical now lost oral tradition, is contacted by the child's mother. Blaise immediately baptizes the boy at birth, thus freeing him from the power of Satan in his intended destiny. So what happens here is it goes a little bit deeper into Merlin's intended destiny by the dark forces to become an antichrist in that time period, or some sort of evil false prophet, a agent of chaos in the sense he would have wreaked havoc on their society, but instead he was geared into the direction of a godly path, and this is the argument of nurture versus nature. In the story of Merlin, you can see parallels between the conflict between his flesh and his desire and passion to do the path of the godly. The demonic legacy invests Merlin, already able to speak fluently even as a newborn, with a preternatural knowledge of the past and present, which is supplemented by God, who gives the boy prophetic knowledge of the future. The text lays great emphasis on Merlin's power to shapeshift, which is featured prominently on his joking personality and on his connection to the Holy Grail, the quest for which foretells, inspired by Wace's Roman Debert, an Anglo-Norman creative adaptation of Gorfey's Historia. Merlin was originally part of a cycle of Robert's poems telling the story of the Grail over the centuries. The narrative of Merlin is largely based on Gorfey's familiar tale of Vortigern's Tower, Uther's war against the Saxons, and Arthur's conception. What follows is a new episode of the young Arthur, who had been secreted away by Merlin, drawing of the sword from the stone, and even orchestrated by Merlin in the role of the Kingmaker. Earlier, Merlin also instructs Uther to establish the original order of the Round Table for 50 members, following his own act of having created the table itself. The text ends with the coronation of Arthur. More on Merlin's parentage. The prose version of Robert's poem was then continued in the 13th century. Merlin continuation, or suit, de Merlin, that tells of Arthur's early wars and Merlin's role in them. The mage both predicts and wielding elemental magic influences the course of battles, also helping the young Arthur in other ways. The extended prose rendering of Merlin became one of the foundations for the Lancelot Grail, a vast cyclical series of Old French prose works, also known as the Vulgate cycle, when it was directly incorporated into it as the Istar de Merlin, also known as the Vulgate Merlin or the Prose Merlin. There, while not identifying his mother, it is stated that Merlin was named after his grandfather on her side. Because that would be obvious, because his father's side was some sort of demonic being. A further reworking and continuation of the prose Merlin were included within the subsequent post-Vulgate cycle as post-Vulgate suit do Merlin or the Hutch. Merlin adding some episodes such as Merlin providing Arthur with the sword Excalibur through the Lady of the Lake. His magical interventions in the post-Vulgates. Merlin is relatively limited and markedly less spectacular, even compared to the magical feats of his own students, and his character became less moral. In addition, Merlin's prophecies also include sets of alternative possibilities. Future can be changed instead of only certain outcomes. Both Merlin and its continuations have been adapted in verse and prose, translated into several languages, and further modified to various degrees by other authors. Notably, the post-Vulgate suit, along with earlier versions of the prose Merlin, was the main source for the opening part of Thomas Malory's English language completion work, Le Morte d'Arthur, which formed a now iconic version of the legend, compared to some of his French sources, such as the Vulgate Lancelot, informing that Merlin was treacherous and disloyal by nature, like his demon father before him. Malory limited the extent of the negative association of Merlin and his powers, relatively rarely being condemned as demonic by other characters, such as King Lot, instead presenting him as an ambiguous trickster. Controversially, Merlin seems to be inherently evil in the so-called non-cyclic Lancelot, where he was born to the fatherless child, from not a supernatural grape of a virgin, but a consensual union between a lustful demon and an unmarried beautiful young lady, and was never baptized. The prose Lancelot further relates that after growing up in the borderlands between Scotland and Ireland, Merlin possessed all wisdom that can come from demons, which is why he was so feared by the Britons, and so revered that everyone called him a holy prophet, and the ordinary people all called him their god. So, in these stories, how it's based and pieced together from different things, and in my opinion, from the biblical perspective, this character, it would make sense that he would have characteristics from the demonic father and the human side from the mother, and it looks like he learned and had certain abilities from the supernatural angelic side he had, which are fallen angels, but he used it, depending I guess on which story, he used it for something good, overall, canonically speaking. So, and it shows a good lesson, and it is very well put together. He was a trickster and wasn't perfect, but he still helped Arthur on his quests. Merlin as a seer. As the Arthurian myths were retold, Merlin's prophetic seer aspects were sometimes de-emphasized or seemingly vanished entirely, as in their fragmentary and more fantastical liberty artists, in favor of portraying him as a wizard and an advisor to the young Arthur, sometimes in the struggle between good and evil sides of his character. So he had like an eternal conflict with this situation because of his father being the demon and his mother being a human. He had an internal conflict. And living in the deep forests, connected with nature, through his ability to change his shape, he may appear as a wild man figure, evoking that of a prototype of Merlin Wilt. As a civilized man of any age, including a very young child, or even as a talking animal, his guises can be highly deformed and animalistic, even when Merlin is presenting as a human or a humanoid being. Percival in prose, also known as the Didote Percival, and also attributed to Robert, where Merlin is the initiator of the Grail quest and cannot be deleted until the end of days. He eventually retires after Arthur's downfall by turning himself into a bird and entering the mysterious Esplimure, never to be seen again. In the Vulgate Cycle's version of Merlin, his acts include arranging the communication of Arthur's desire for the most beautiful maiden ever born, Lady Lysanor of Cardigan, resulting in the birth of Arthur's illegitimate son, Lohut, from before the marriage to Guinevere. But fate cannot always be changed. The post-Vulgate cycle has Merlin warn Arthur of how the birth of his other son will bring great misfortune and ruin to his kingdom, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Eventually, long after Merlin is gone, his advice to dispose of the baby Mordred through an event evoking the biblical massacre of the innocents led to the deletion of many, among them Arthur the Orginal Chronicle of Scotland, which sympathizes with Mordred, as usual in Scottish chronicle tradition, particularly attributes Merlin's supernatural evil influence on Arthur to its very negative portrayal of his rule. Many other medieval works dealing with the Merlin legend include the 13th century Lee Roman de Silence. The Prophecies de Merlin contains long prophecies of Merlin, mostly concerned with the 11th to 13th century Italian history and the contemporary politics, some by his ghost after his death, interspersed with episodes relating Merlin's deeds with assorted Arthurian adventures, in which Merlin does not appear at all. It pictures Merlin as a righteous seer, chastising people for their sins, as does the 13th to 14th Italian story collection, Tu Navalio, which draws heavily from it. Even more political Italian text was Joachim of Fiorte's Expositio Sibyllae e Merlini, directed against Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, whom the author regarded as the Antichrist. The earliest Merlin text written in Germany was Caesarius of Heisterbach's, later Dialogus Macurorum 1220, Ulrich Futitas, 15th century Buch der Abenteuer, in the section based on Albrecht von Schaffenberg's Lost Merlin, presents Merlin as a Uther's father, effectively making his grandson, Arthur, a part devil as well. Baudouin Butter's 1294 romance, known as either Le Fils du Roquenstant or Pradagus et le Vigneur, names Merlin's usually unspecified mother as Optima, daughter of King Melis of Dementi, while Paulinio Paris, 14th century Italian, La Storia di Merlinio, calls her Marinia. In the second continuation of Percival, the story of the Grail, a young daughter of Merlin himself, called the Lady of the High Peak of Mount Dolorous, appears to guide Percival towards the Grail Castle. The earliest English version, romance, concerning Merlin is of Arthur, and of Merlin of the late 13th century, which drew from the chronicles of the Vulgate cycle in English, and specifically the English language, medieval texts, and conflate Britain with the Kingdom of England and the Anglo-Saxon enemies, against whom Merlin aids, first Uther and then Arthur, tend to be replaced by Saracens, or simply just invading pagans. The 15th century English poem Sir Gauther presents Titular, redeemed half-demon, as Merlin's half-brother. In Britain, Merlin has remained as much as a prophet as a magician up to and including the 16th century, when political content in the style of Agrippa di Agni continued to be written using Merlin's name to guarantee their authenticity. During the 15th century, Welsh work predicting the Celtic revenge and victory over the Saxons would be recast as Merlin's Midrid's prophecies and used along with Gorfy by propaganda of the Welsh descent, the 7th of England, who fought under the Red Dragon banner, as the House of Tudor, which traced its lineage directly to Arthur. Later, the Tudors' Welsh supporters, including bards, interpreting the prophecy of King Arthur's return as having been fulfilled after their ascent to the throne of England, that they sought to legitimize following the Wars of the Roses. Prophecies attributed to Merlin have also been used by the 14th century Welsh hero Owain Glyndwr in his fight against the English rule. The vagueness of Merlin's prophecies enabled British monarchs and historians to continue using them even to the early modern period, notably the King of Scotland and also of England and Ireland, James VI and First, claimed his 1603 unification of Britain into the United Kingdom as have been foretold by Merlin. It's interesting to see how back in a certain time period, Merlin and King Arthur's existence was seen as a fact in that time period. And also you had even these kings that were claiming they were fulfilling prophecies, and different groups like the people on the Celtic groups claiming they fulfilled it by fighting the English, and the English being related to both groups because they intermixed with them, that they fulfilled it by uniting the two kingdoms together. And it's interesting to see how they took it seriously, and I think that it's a very peculiar thing to wonder what made them think it was real. Of course, in this time period, there wasn't modern advancements or technology, but I still like to research this, and I think that it's good to see both perspectives about the topic. Merlin's apprentice in the chivalric romances is often Arthur's half-sister, Morgan Le Fay, who is sometimes depicted as Merlin's lover, and sometimes as just his unrequited love interest. In the prophecies de Merlin, he also tutors with Sabile and two other witch queens, and the Lady of the Isle of Avalon. The others who have learned sorcery from Merlin, including the wise damsel in the Italian Historia di Merlinio, and the male wizard Mabon. In the post-Vulgate Merlin continuation in prose Tristan, his various apprentices gain or expand their magical powers through Merlin. However, his prophetic powers cannot be passed on. That is interesting, how these different wizards and witches expanded on what they learned from him in these legends. As they say, we stand on the shoulders of others, and they twisted, in a good way, twisted things around and expanded and learned more magic based off of what he taught them. And in regular life now, I can think of things where I learned from different YouTubers and different people, and I made my own thing out of it. And I'm sure you, the viewer, as well, can see these parallels. And it was a very well put together legend. Or perhaps some truth in these legends. You never know. Tales of Merlin's End. The prose, chivalric romance tradition, Merlin has a major weakness that leads him to his relatively early doom. Young, beautiful woman of femme fatale archetype. However, contrary to the many modern works in which they are arch enemies, Merlin and Morgan are never opposed to each other in any medieval tradition, other than Morgan forcibly rejecting him in some texts. In fact, his love for Morgan is so great that he even lies to the king to save her in the Huth Merlin, which is the only instance of him ever intentionally misleading Arthur. Instead, Merlin's eventual undoing comes from his lusting after another of his female students, the one often named Vivain, which I've spoken about her in the other video, The Lady of the Lake, among various other names and spellings, including Mallory's own Nevive, that his editor, William Caxton, changed it to Nimue, which in turn eventually becomes the now popular name Nimue. She is also called a fee, like Morgan, and described as a Lady of the Lake, or the chief of the Lady of the Lake. In the case of Mallory's Nimue, in Purse Forest, the ancestry of both Merlin and Lady of the Lake is descended from the ancient fairy Morgane, unrelated to the sister of King Arthur, who had cursed their bloodline when she wrongly believed that her daughter was raped by her daughter's human lover. That is very interesting. It seems there are some twists and turns that happen. With great power comes great responsibility, everyone. And it would be good for these magical beings, or people with these abilities, to use their gifts, if you would call them that, wisely. Vivain's character, in relation to Merlin, is first found in the Lancelot Grail cycle, after having been inserted into the legend of Merlin by either De Bohun or his continuator. There are many different versions of the story. Common themes in most of them include Merlin actually having the prior prophetic knowledge of her plot against him. One exception is the Spanish post-Vulgate Baladro, where his foresight ability is explicitly dampened by perverted desires, but lacking either ability or will to counteract it in any way, along with her using one of his own spells to get rid of him, usually including in Le Morte d'Arthur. Having learned everything she could from him, Vivain will then also replace the eliminated Merlin within the story, taking up his role as Arthur's advisor and court mage. And also something that I want to mention is that I think with these situations it shows it's good to have willpower and control. Even this magical wizard had a human flaw. And I did a video, as I said, about this whole thing and how it works out. There will be a card that pops up that you can see. And further reading. However, Merlin's fate of either demise or eternal imprisonment, along with his destroyer or captor's motivation from her fear of Merlin and protecting her own virginity, her jealousy of his relationship with Morgan, is recounted differently in variants of this motif. The exact form of his prison or grave can also variably a cave, a tree, or a hole, either within under a large rock, according to Le Morte d'Arthur. This happens somewhere in Benwick, the kingdom of Lancelot's father, or an invisible tower of only magic with no physical walls. The scene is often placed in the enchanted forest of Brocéliande, a legendary location today identified with the real-life Paimpont forest in Brittany, a Breton tradition cited by Roger Sherman, Loomis in Celtic myth and Arthurian romance, also asserting there that it seems almost certain that Morgan Le Fay and the Lady of the Lake were originally the same person. In the legend, has Merlin trapped by his mistress inside a tree or on the island of Idison. Ninaine, as the Lady of the Lake, student of Merlin, is known in the Livre d'Atu. Continuation of Merlin is mentioned as having broken his heart before his later second relationship with Morgan. But here the text does not tell how exactly Merlin did vanish, other than relating his farewell meeting with Blaise in the Vulgate Lancelot, which predated the later Vulgate Merlin. She makes Merlin sleep forever in a pit in the forest of Denault, and that is where he remained, for never again did anyone see or hear of him, or have news to tell him. In the post-Vulgate suit, de Merlin, the young king Bagdemagus, one of the early Knights of the Round Table, manages to find the rock under which Merlin is entombed alive by Nivane, as she is named there. He communicates with Merlin, but is unable to lift the stone. What follows next is supposedly narrated in the mysterious text, Conte d'Ilbre, Tale of the Cry. In Prophéties de Merlin, his tomb is unsuccessfully searched for by various parties, including Morgan and her enchantresses, but cannot be accessed due to the deadly magic traps around it, while the Lady of the Lake comes to taunt Merlin by asking did he rot there yet. One notably alternate version, having a happier ending for Merlin, is contained within the Prometheus section of the Livre du Graal, where Ninaine peacefully confines him in Brocéliande, with walls of air, visible only as a mist to others, but as a beautiful yet unbreakable crystal tower to him. Only Merlin's disembodied voice can escape his prison one last time when he speaks to Gawain on the knight's quest to find him, where they will then spend almost every night together as lovers, besides evoking the final scenes from Vita Merlini. This particular variant of their story also mirrors episodes found in some texts, wherein Merlin either is an object of one-sided desire by different amours, sorceresses, who too unsuccessfully plots to trap him, or it is Merlin himself who traps an unwilling lover with his magic. And Merlin eventually gets out of this situation, and he continues on with his life. So he eventually overcame that.